Welcome back to the program. While Russian nuclear testing has some Western leaders spooked, the United States is claiming it's not afraid of Moscow's growing military capabilities. Well, that's at least the message U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice is putting out. She says the balance of power in terms of nuclear deterrence is not going to be affected by those measures. And she adds that probably the Russians understand the United States has an extremely robust, capable, broad and indeed varied nuclear deterrent. While the American confidence seems unshaken, Russia has gone one step ahead and exploited the fractures in the U.S. political relations with its South American neighbors. Russia has strengthened its ties with Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. It's sending a naval squadron to Venezuela for joint exercises in November. And Russia has sold Venezuela weapons worth billions of dollars since 2005 and announced a $1 billion credit for arms purchases last month. In addition, 2 Russian bombers capable of carrying nuclear missiles arrived in Venezuela to carry out training flights. Well, the 2 countries have been rapidly building closer military and economic ties. They've spoken of their opposition to U.S. global dominance. Some say this is Russia's show of force in the strategic backyard of the United States and an attempt to counterbalance American influence. We're still joined by our guests in Moscow, Alexander Pikayev, in Washington, D.C., Richard Weitz, and in London, Matthew Clements. Thank you for joining us. So I could start once again with Alexander. When you start building nuclear submarines and missiles, you're aiming at arenas beyond local situations like Georgia, aren't you?
Well, Russian strategic capabilities is, of course, not against Georgia. It is its aim is to deter more predominant counterpart, like the United States, like NATO, like maybe China, maybe some other countries. And Russia still possesses quite capable nuclear deterrent. Its size is on decrease, like the size of American nuclear deterrent. According to US-Russian arms control agreements, the Russians removed from active service 2/3 of the systems which they possessed just 15 years ago. But still there is a need to maintain what Russians still have. And under this situation, such maneuvers are inevitable. There were not too much maneuvers, not too much tests in 1990s because lack of money. But now, when financial situation improves, there are more tests, more maneuvers. But still, the Russians have a very modest modernization program. One of the tests of the Topol system was aimed at checking whether existing systems could serve 10 years more. And this system was deployed in 1980s, so that it is 20 years in service. And the Russians want to keep them on service for another 10 years in order to avoid expensive replacement of old missiles by new missiles. It's expensive to produce them. It's much cheaper to maintain existing systems.
Right, so a mix of trying to maintain as well as produce there. Richard, is Russia trying to reassert itself as a global power, perhaps trying to reclaim some of the clout the Soviet Union once enjoyed? How's it seen from Washington?
Yes, it's seen as, yes, that Russia is trying to reaffirm its status as a global power. And that's not only military, that's economic, that's energy. But that's, in some ways, that's considered natural. I mean, the 1990s are now considered a bit of an aberration when Russia went through an unusual period of self-effacement, perhaps coming over the shock of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And certainly, we're involved in the project here in trying to consider how Russia could, with the United States, become a better global stakeholder. So
can it really do that, though, given, sorry to interrupt you, but given what Alexander was saying in Moscow, that actually, you know, a lot of the spending is just to maintain what it already has rather than expand its military power. Can that be translated into political influence?
Well, as I think you correctly point out in your beginning commentary, Russia's main role so far has been to act a bit of a spoiler. It's been picking up, improving ties with regimes which, for one way or another, are alienated from the United States. That be that Venezuela, Cuba's a possibility, Hamas certainly has moved close to Russia. That may prove true elsewhere. The Central Asian governments, it's still not clear. China's always a possibility. So Russia can benefit a lot from flawed U.S. policies in terms of, insofar as it needs to accrue benefits and global influence. Ideally, though, the two countries work together since they share so many security and other concerns in common.
All right, before we talk about the possibility of them working together or why that hasn't happened to the degree some expected, Matthew in London, can Moscow develop more than a military alliance that's based on more than simply selling weapons to some of these countries we've been talking about, like Venezuela?
Well, to a degree, no, because I think a lot of its relationship with Venezuela and indeed Cuba and the naval exercises that will be taking place with Venezuela in November are in a part muscle flexing, but primarily designed to maintain good relations with a friendly nation who is willing to buy large quantities of Russian arms.
So what you're basically saying then, Matthew, is that what we're seeing is arms sales. Without translating that into a deeper sort of military alliance, can it really ever counterbalance the US sort of political alliance and domination it has?
No, not really. I think maybe perhaps a better example would be in trying to create a deeper kind of military understanding is Russia's relationship with Syria, because it's trying to look at utilising the Tarsus naval base to give it a permanent presence in the Mediterranean. But again, this is fairly limited, and it's a fair deal of time away. So no, a lot of these relationships are, although serving a secondary purpose of muscle flexing, really are part of an economic dialogue and an attempt to sell more arms.
All right, let's go back to Moscow. Alexander, is Russia trying to perhaps readjust the calculations and flashpoints like expansion of NATO, Iran, North Korea, the Balkans, through beefing up its military?
Well, actually, regarding Latin America, I think that Moscow is concerned by bullying policy the United States produces over those countries, and Russia provides those countries with a chance to diversify their foreign policy in order to avoid a dominance of the United States. And beyond Venezuela, Russia traditionally had very good relations with many other Latin American countries, like Brazil, for instance. It's a very healthy and growing relationship. Russia also, but what is also important, that Moscow doesn't want to create any anti-American coalition having, let's say, alliance with North Korea or Iran. Iran and North Korea are not Russian allies. Russia, together with the United States, China, some other countries, they are working together in order to convince North Koreans to denuclearize. They are working together to convince Iran not to go nuclear. And Russia works together with the United States in many other areas, including the Middle East. Yes, there is a considerable disagreement over NATO enlargement, particularly on accession of Georgia and Ukraine. There are differences here, and Russia would defend its interests.
All right, we've got about a minute left. I want to go over to Richard for a quick comment. Listening to what Alexander's saying there, it doesn't sound to me like there's much prospect of a return to the Cold War, despite the differences between Russia and the US.
I think that's correct. I think that at the moment, U.S. strategic focus is really elsewhere. It's not really that alarmed by what's happening in Russia. As I said, it's more concerned with immediate prospects of, say, nuclear terrorism or what's going to happen with transition. We're about to experience our first transition in power in the United States between presidential administrations since 9/11. What kind of vulnerabilities that might open up, we're just unsure of. And Russia's a factor, but it's not considered the dominant factor in U.S. strategic thinking the way it was during the Cold War.
All right, we'll have to leave it there because we have run out of time, and thank our guests, Alexander Pikayev, advisor to the Duma's Defense Committee in Moscow, Richard Weitz from the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., and Matthew Clements from Janes in London. Thank you for joining us here on this episode of Inside Story. And thank you for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Feel free to email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. For now, it's goodbye.